Bullies tie the boy to railroad tracks. He broke free and tied them up instead. Marcus Rivera had always been the kind of kid who preferred shadows to spotlights. At 17, he possessed the unremarkable build of someone who spent more time with books than barbells. Lean but not muscular, average height, with dark hair that perpetually fell across his forehead no matter how many times he pushed it back. His olive skin bore the heritage of his Mexican grandmother, something that hadn't gone unnoticed by certain students at Riverside High School since his family moved to the small Ohio town 3 months ago. The move had been necessary after his father's military transfer, but Marcus had learned long ago not to complain about such things. What others didn't know, what nobody at Riverside High could possibly guess, was that Marcus had spent the last 8 years training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Muay Thai at various military bases around the world. His father, Sergeant Major Rivera, had insisted on it after Marcus had been bullied at his first school in Germany. The training had become as natural as breathing, but Marcus had made a promise to his father. Violence was always the last resort, to be used only when there was no other choice. Keep your head down, stay focused on your studies, and let your actions speak louder than your fists, his father had said before deploying to his latest assignment. You're stronger than you know, but real strength is knowing when not to use it. That philosophy had served Marcus well during his first weeks at Riverside High, even as he quickly identified the school's predators. The leader was obvious enough: Jake Thornton, a stocky senior with buzzed blonde hair and the kind of swagger that came from never being challenged. He commanded a small pack that included his lieutenant Dylan Hayes, tall, lanky, with dead eyes that seemed to enjoy others' pain, and Tommy Rodriguez, ironically the only other Hispanic student in their grade, who seemed desperate to prove his loyalty to Jake by being twice as cruel to anyone who reminded the group of his own heritage. The old brick building of Riverside High felt like a maze of potential ambush points to Marcus. The narrow hallways between classes, the isolated stairwells leading to the basement, the blind corners near the gymnasium, all places where a pack could corner their prey without interference. The cafeteria, with its long tables and tribal seating arrangements, served as the daily theater where social hierarchies played out in full view of 300 students. Marcus had managed to navigate these dangers for nearly 3 months through careful observation and strategic invisibility. He ate lunch alone at a corner table, kept his earbuds in during passing periods, and chose seats near exits in every classroom. The system worked until the day he made his first mistake. He helped. Sarah Martinez was a freshman, small even for her age, with thick glasses and a stutter that made her an obvious target. Marcus watched from across the cafeteria as Jake's crew surrounded her table, knocking her books to the floor while Dylan held her backpack just out of reach. The other students carefully avoided eye contact, suddenly fascinated by their food or phones. Please, Sarah stammered, reaching futilely for her bag. I need those books for what? Jake interrupted, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet section of the cafeteria. To bore us to death with your weird science projects? Marcus felt his jaw clench as Tommy grabbed Sarah's notebook and pretended to read from it in an exaggerated stutter. The girl's face turned crimson as tears began forming behind her glasses. Around them, 36 students continued their carefully choreographed dance of willful blindness. Before he could stop himself, Marcus was moving. He crossed the cafeteria with the fluid economy of motion that 8 years of martial arts training had ingrained in his muscle memory. But to the casual observer, he simply looked like another student walking purposefully toward the exit. "Hey," he said quietly, appearing beside Tommy with the kind of sudden presence that made people jump. "You dropped something." Tommy spun around, Sarah's notebook still in his hands. "What?" "Your dignity," Marcus replied, his voice carrying just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. A few students snickered, and Tommy's face darkened. Jake stepped forward, his bulk casting a shadow over Marcus. "You got something to say, Bina?" The slur hung in the air like a physical presence. Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the flood of adrenaline that always preceded violence. His body wanted to move, wanted to demonstrate just how quickly he could put Jake on the floor, but his father's voice echoed in his mind. Last resort only. Just thought she might need her book back, Marcus said, extending his hand toward Tommy. For class. Class? Dylan laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the cafeteria's ambient noise. What class teaches wetbacks how to pick fruit? More students were watching now, some pulling out phones to record whatever was about to happen. Marcus could see Sarah in his peripheral vision, still frozen at her table, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Give her the book," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the storm building inside him. Jake stepped closer, close enough that Marcus could smell the guy's cheap cologne and see the small scar above his left eyebrow. "Or what, Taco Boy? You gonna do something about it?" For a moment, Marcus almost did. His body knew exactly how to respond. A simple hip toss would put Jake on his back in seconds, probably concussed from the impact with the floor. From there, it would be easy to control Dylan and Tommy before they could even process what had happened. 8 years of training had made such movements as natural as walking. Instead, he stepped back. "Just give her the book." Jake's grin was predatory. "Look at this, guys. The little Mexican's got some fight in him after all." He shoved Marcus hard in the chest, sending him stumbling backward into an empty chair. But not much. The cafeteria erupted in the kind of nervous laughter that always followed these displays. Tommy threw Sarah's notebook at her feet, its pages scattering across the floor. The 3 boys swaggered away, high-fiving each other as they went. Marcus knelt to help Sarah gather her papers, his hands steady despite the rage coursing through him. "You okay?" She nodded, still crying, and whispered a barely audible "thank you" before fleeing toward the hallway. That afternoon marked the beginning of Marcus's real education at Riverside High. Jake's crew had identified him as a target worth their attention, and they pursued their new hobby with the dedicated enthusiasm of apex predators who had found fresh prey. It started small, shoulder checks in the hallway that sent Marcus careening into lockers, accidental spills that left his backpack soaked with milk or soda, the constant barrage of racial slurs delivered just quietly enough to avoid teacher intervention. Marcus endured it all with the same stoic silence he'd maintained during their first encounter, but each incident chipped away at his resolve. The worst part wasn't the physical harassment. Marcus had endured far worse during training sessions. It was the isolation. His intervention on Sarah's behalf had marked him as someone who would stand up to bullies, which paradoxically made him radioactive to the other students. Nobody wanted to be associated with someone who had painted a target on his back. Even Sarah avoided him now, ducking her head and hurrying past whenever their paths crossed. Marcus understood. She was just trying to survive, same as everyone else. But it stung nonetheless. 3 weeks into his new reality, the harassment escalated. Marcus was leaving his last class of the day when he found his locker decorated with a crude drawing of a man in a sombrero being deported over a wall. The words, "Go home, Pedro," were scrawled across the metal in permanent marker. "Like our artwork?" Jake's voice carried from down the hallway. He approached with his usual entourage, plus a few new faces who had apparently joined the entertainment committee. Marcus stared at the drawing, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. The janitor, Mr. Peterson, walked past without making eye contact, his cart squeaking as he disappeared around the corner. "My name's Marcus," he said quietly, working his combination lock. "Not anymore," Dylan laughed. "From now on, you're Pedro. Pedro the wetback." Tommy opened Marcus's locker and knocked his books to the floor, then kicked them down the hallway. "Oops," he said with mock concern. "Better hurry, Pedro, or you'll miss your bus back to Mexico." Marcus knelt to gather his scattered belongings, acutely aware of the small crowd that had gathered to watch the show. Among them, he spotted several students recording with their phones. By tomorrow, the video would probably be circulating throughout the school. "You know what your problem is, Pedro," Jake said, looming over him. "You think you're better than us, coming in here with your quiet tough guy act, like you're some kind of hero." Marcus straightened, his arms full of textbooks and loose papers. "I just want to go home." "Then go," Jake said, spreading his arms wide. "Nobody's stopping you. Get on a bus, swim across the Rio Grande, whatever you people do." The hallway had grown quiet, except for the electronic chirping of phone cameras. Marcus could feel dozens of eyes on him, waiting to see if he would finally break, if he would give them the violence they were hoping to witness and share. Instead, he walked away. That night, Marcus stared at his ceiling and wondered if his father had been wrong. Maybe there were situations where turning the other cheek only invited more abuse. Maybe some people only understood one language. But every time he considered abandoning his principles, he remembered his father's words. "The moment you become what you hate, they win." The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in late October. Marcus was walking across the school parking lot when he heard the sound of screeching tires and laughter. Jake's lifted pickup truck swerved toward him, close enough that the mirror brushed his backpack. The truck skidded to a stop, and all three boys piled out. "Sorry, Pedro," Jake called out, his voice dripping with false concern. "Didn't see you there. Maybe you should wear brighter colors so people can spot you." A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Marcus recognized some faces from his classes, kids who had never spoken to him, but who seemed eager to witness whatever was about to happen. "We've been thinking," Dylan said, circling around behind Marcus like a shark. "You've been at our school for months now, but you've never really participated in any of our traditions." Tommy produced a length of rope from the truck bed, and Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. "Yeah," Tommy added, his voice taking on an edge that hadn't been there before. "Time for Pedro to learn about American customs." The abandoned railroad tracks ran behind the school, cutting through a stretch of woods that separated the campus from the residential area beyond. Marcus had walked past them dozens of times, never imagining they would become the setting for his nightmare. "This is how we welcome new students," Jake explained, as they marched him through the trees, the small crowd following at a safe distance like spectators at a Roman circus. "Especially ones who think they're too good to show proper respect." Marcus's mind raced as they approached the rusted rails. He could break free, even with his hands zip-tied behind his back. He knew at least 3 different ways to disable Jake before the other 2 could react. But there were witnesses, phones recording, and any violence he committed would be captured and shared throughout the school by morning. More importantly, his father's voice continued to echo in his head. "Violence is always the last resort." But as Dylan forced him to his knees beside the tracks and Tommy began securing the rope around his ankles, Marcus wondered if he had finally found that last resort. "Don't worry, Pedro," Jake said, testing the knots. "The 5:15 freight doesn't come through for another hour. Plenty of time for you to think about whether you want to keep disrespecting us." The rope was military-grade paracord, the kind Marcus had used during survival training. But it was tied by amateurs who had learned their knots from YouTube videos rather than drill sergeants. Even with his hands restrained, Marcus could feel the weaknesses in their work. "This is insane," someone in the crowd whispered. "We should call the police." "With what?" Dylan laughed. "Pedro's probably illegal anyway. Cops would just deport him." The group began to disperse as the reality of what they were watching set in. Some students hurried away, suddenly eager to be somewhere else. Others lingered, their phones still recording, caught between fascination and horror. Jake leaned down close to Marcus's ear. "Next time, maybe you'll think twice before playing hero for some stuttering freak." They left him there, zip-tied and roped to the tracks, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Marcus could hear their laughter fading as they made their way back through the woods, followed by the nervous chatter of the remaining spectators. Alone on the tracks, Marcus closed his eyes and let his training take over. The zip ties were cheap plastic, the kind that could be broken with the right technique. He had learned the method during a survival course at Fort Bragg. Position the ties above your head, then bring your arms down sharply while pulling them apart. The stress would concentrate at the locking mechanism's weakest point. It took 3 attempts, but the ties finally snapped. The rope was more challenging, but Marcus had been studying it during the entire walk through the woods. Tommy had used a clove hitch around his ankles, secure against pulling, but vulnerable to the right kind of twisting motion. With his hands free, Marcus was able to work the rope loose in less than 5 minutes. He stood up, brushing dirt from his clothes, and listened carefully. He could still hear voices in the distance. Jake's crew and their audience were probably heading back to the parking lot, confident that their victim was securely trapped. Marcus smiled for the first time in weeks. He made his way back through the woods with the fluid silence of someone who had been trained to move unseen. The crowd was smaller now, maybe a dozen students clustered around Jake's truck, passing around phones to watch and re-watch the footage they had captured. "Did you see his face when we tied him up?" Dylan was saying. "Thought he was gonna cry." "Should have taken a selfie," Tommy added. Pedro's big railroad adventure. They were so focused on their phones that none of them noticed Marcus emerging from the tree line. He moved with predatory grace, covering the 50 yards of open ground without making a sound. "Having fun?" he asked quietly. The effect was immediate and electric. Jake spun around, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally fear as he processed what he was seeing. "That's impossible," Dylan breathed. "The rope was tied by amateurs," Marcus finished. He held up the severed zip ties and the coiled paracord. "Did you really think YouTube was going to teach you better knots than the US Army?" The remaining students began backing away, suddenly understanding that they were witnessing something far more dangerous than a simple bullying incident. Several phones continued recording, but now their owners held them with shaking hands. Jake recovered first, his shock transforming into rage. "You think you're smart, Pedro. Think you're tough." He reached into his truck bed and pulled out a tire iron. "Let's see how tough you really are." Dylan and Tommy moved to flank Marcus, forming a triangle with Jake at the point. They had done this before. Marcus could see it in the way they positioned themselves, the casual coordination that spoke of practiced violence. 3-on-1, Marcus observed, his voice still calm. "And you brought a weapon. Your parents must be so proud." Jake raised the tire iron above his head. "Shut up and—" He never finished the sentence. Marcus moved with the explosive speed of someone who had spent 8 years learning to turn his body into a weapon. A simple step and pivot took him inside Jake's swing, and a palm strike to the solar plexus dropped the bigger boy to his knees, gasping for breath. The tire iron clattered to the asphalt. Dylan charged from the left, throwing a wild haymaker that Marcus slipped easily. A foot sweep sent Dylan crashing to the ground, where a precise application of pressure to his wrist kept him pinned and screaming. Tommy hesitated, suddenly realizing that he was facing someone far more dangerous than the quiet kid they had been tormenting for weeks. When he finally committed to his attack, it was too late. Marcus caught his punch, used his momentum against him, and put him face first into the side of Jake's truck with a hip toss that would have made his instructors proud. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. Marcus straightened his shirt and looked around at the stunned faces of his audience. Jake was still on his knees, clutching his stomach and making small whimpering sounds. Dylan lay on his side, cradling his wrist. Tommy was unconscious against the truck, a thin line of blood trickling from his nose. "Now," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence, "let's talk about respect." He walked over to Jake's truck and retrieved the coil of paracord. "You wanted to show me American traditions," he continued, methodically cutting the rope into 3 equal lengths. "Let me show you one of mine." Jake tried to crawl away, but Marcus grabbed him by the shirt and hauled him upright. "It's called consequences," Marcus explained as he began tying Jake's hands behind his back with the same kind of knots the bullies had failed to master. Very popular concept in the military. Dylan had recovered enough to try to run, but Marcus caught him before he made it 10 feet. The boy's wrist was probably sprained, making it easy to control him as Marcus secured his hands as well. Tommy was still unconscious when Marcus tied him up, but he was breathing steadily. The blood from his nose had already stopped flowing. "What are you doing?" Sarah Martinez's voice came from the edge of the crowd. She had appeared at some point during the confrontation, drawn by the commotion like everyone else. Marcus looked up from his work. "Teaching a lesson in empathy," he said. "They seemed to think it was fun to tie people up and leave them helpless. I thought they might benefit from experiencing it themselves." He dragged all 3 boys to the flagpole in the center of the parking lot and secured them to it with the remaining rope. Jake had recovered enough to curse and struggle, but the knots were military-grade now, tied by someone who had learned from experts. "This is kidnapping," Jake shouted. "You can't do this." Marcus knelt down so he was eye-level with his former tormentor. "You tied me to railroad tracks," he said quietly, "with a train coming. That's attempted murder." He gestured to the dozen students still watching from a safe distance. "And it's all on video." Jake's face went pale as the implications sank in. "But here's the thing," Marcus continued, standing up. "I'm not like you. I'm not going to leave you here to wonder if you're going to die. I'm going to call the principal, the police, and probably the fire department to come untie you." He paused. Eventually, he pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. "While we wait, maybe you can think about how it feels to be helpless, to be humiliated in front of your peers, to wonder if the person who has power over you is going to show mercy." The crowd had grown as word spread throughout the school. Students were streaming out of the building, drawn by rumors of a fight that had gone very differently than anyone expected. Marcus could see teachers beginning to emerge as well, alerted by the commotion. "Mr. Rivera!" Principal Henderson's voice boomed across the parking lot as he approached with 2 security guards. "What is the meaning of this?" Marcus didn't run. He stood calmly beside the flagpole, his hands at his sides, and waited for the authorities to reach him. "These 3 students tied me to railroad tracks, sir," he said simply. "I'm sure several people have video evidence. I defended myself, then secured them here to prevent their escape before the police could arrive." Principal Henderson looked from Marcus to the 3 boys tied to the flagpole, then to the crowd of students holding up phones. "Someone called 911? "I was just about to," Marcus replied, holding up his phone. The next hour was a blur of police officers, paramedics, and very serious conversations. Marcus found himself handcuffed in the back of a patrol car, while Detective Morrison reviewed phone footage with increasingly dark expressions. "Kid," Detective Morrison said when he finally approached Marcus, "you know I have to arrest you for assault." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, "but I also have to tell you that what those boys did to you." He shook his head. "Tying someone to railroad tracks is a felony, multiple felonies actually, false imprisonment, reckless endangerment, conspiracy to commit assault." He paused. "Your lawyer's going to have a field day with self-defense claims." The charges against Marcus were dropped within a week. The video evidence was overwhelming. Dozens of students had captured Jake's crew, marching him to the tracks, tying him up and leaving him there. The district attorney called it the clearest case of self-defense I've seen in 20 years. Jake, Dylan, and Tommy weren't so fortunate. All 3 were expelled from Riverside High and faced serious criminal charges. Jake's family hired expensive lawyers, but the evidence was impossible to dispute. He was ultimately sentenced to juvenile detention and court-ordered anger management. The change at school was immediate and profound. Students who had avoided Marcus for months suddenly wanted to sit with him at lunch. Teachers who had never noticed him before went out of their way to ask how he was doing. The hallways felt different, less predatory, more welcoming. But the most significant change was in Marcus himself. For the first time since arriving at Riverside High, he walked with his head up. He made eye contact. He smiled. "You know," Sarah Martinez said one day as they worked together on a chemistry project, "I never got to thank you properly for that first day in the cafeteria." Marcus looked up from his lab notes. "You don't need to thank me. We look out for each other, right?" She smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since that day with her scattered books. "Right." 3 months later, Marcus received a letter from his father, who had finally learned the full story through official military channels. The letter was brief, written in his father's characteristic no-nonsense style. "Son, heard about the railroad incident. Proud of you for trying to handle it peacefully first. Prouder still that you didn't become them when you finally had to act. Violence was your last resort, just like we discussed. That's what separates the good guys from the bad guys, knowing when to fight and when to stop. The bullies learned that actions have consequences. You learned that sometimes standing up for yourself changes everything. Both are important lessons. See you at Christmas. Dad." Marcus folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his wallet. Outside his window, he could see students gathering in the parking lot, their voices carrying on the afternoon breeze. Some were probably talking about homework, others about weekend plans. None of them were afraid. That, Marcus thought, was worth fighting for.